Welcome everyone to our discussion on Chapter 14, Discharge and Remedies. We're still talking about contracts, but now we're talking about sort of the end of the life of the contract. We're talking about when a contract is discharged or terminated, and we're talking then about potential remedies for when a contract, if there's a breach or termination of a contract. So let's get started first by talking about discharge. So there's several methods of discharging a contract. There's conditions precedent, conditions subsequent, and conditions concurrent. Let's first talk about conditions precedent. So this is a condition embedded in a contract that must occur for the contract to be enforceable. And this is an example that you should be familiar with. This is a section of a contract for the sale of property. So you can see there that right up the top it says this contract is contingent on the sale and closing of buyer's property. So in other words, seller is not going to sell this property unless buyer has sold their property. So you can see that highlighted portion, that the sale of buyer's property does not close by a certain date. Buyer may, within 3 days thereafter, deliver written notice to seller terminating this contract, in which event the deposit shall be refunded to buyer, thereby releasing buyer and seller for all further obligations. So another way to look at it is this is just a method of discharging the contract. If the buyer can't sell the property, then the contract is discharged. It's over. The deposit is refunded to the buyer and everyone goes along their way. Conditions subsequent. This is where a future event occurs that ends the obligations of the parties to an agreement. So a classic example of this, and the book gives this example, is a lease agreement. And you can see this quotation there, a possible provision in a lease. This lease agreement will be rendered null and void if lessee is called to full-time active duty by lessee's National Guard unit. So if the lessee with this apartment lease is called to active duty by the National Guard, well, it's written in the lease here that condition subsequent to entering into the lease agreement springs forward and the contract is discharged. Lessee's call-up is a condition subsequent to the lease agreement and terminates his duty to fulfill his obligation under the lease agreement. A more difficult one is conditions concurrent. So in this situation, each party's performance is conditioned on the other party's performance. The performances are to be completed at the same time. So here's an example from the restatement section of contracts. A contracts to sell, A contracts to sell and B to buy a machine for $10,000, delivery of the machine and payment of the price to be made at a stated price on July 1st. On July 1st, both parties are present at that place, but A neither delivers nor offers to deliver the machine, and B neither pays nor offers to pay the price. A has no claim against B, and B has no claim against A. Conditions concurrent. Now, some other methods of discharging a contract are express and implied conditions. So express conditions, those are conditions that are expressly stated in the contract. We saw that in the lease agreement. We saw that in the purchase agreement. There were conditions listed in the contract. So you can see that third bullet down there, the condition precedent in the previous example regarding the purchase of real estate conditioned on the sale of the buyer's current property is an express condition. And then you have implied conditions. They're implied or inferred as a natural condition of the contract. So here's an example. If you agree to sell me certain goods, there is an implied condition that you have the right to sell those goods. Discharged by performance. When you have complete performance, each side has performed their obligations under the agreement, then that's complete performance and everyone's happy. The contract is over, it's fulfilled its purpose. Everyone, again, is happy. There's also such a thing as substantial performance. And here, under this situation, a contract is still discharged, but there may be damages due to the party who fulfilled their obligations, but from the other party who failed to completely fulfill their obligations. We have an example of that in the next slide, and here we go. And this is a variation on the example from the book. This is an example of substantial performance. So here, the contract stated that all rooms are to be painted robin egg blue. The project's completed, but one room was mistakenly painted sky blue. Well, that's substantial performance. Not necessarily a material breach. There was substantial performance, and the owner and contractor are both discharged, but damages may be awarded to compensate the owner to have the room repainted. Now let's talk about discharge by material breach. So material breach, I've quoted a case here, Marion Family YMCA versus Hensel, an Ohio case. Material breach is a failure to do something that is so fundamental to a contract that the failure to perform defeats the essential purpose of the contract or makes it impossible for the other party to perform. And whether a breach is material is a question of fact. In other words, it's in the eye of the beholder, which probably will be in the eye of the court. Okay, let's give an example of, it's a pretty simple example of a material breach. So in this situation, we have a contract for a car, but a truck is delivered. You were expecting a car, but you got a truck. That is a material breach. But manual windows instead of automatic windows, maybe not a material breach. In those circumstances, maybe just damages would be involved. Let's talk about mutual rescission as a way to discharge an agreement. Here, both parties agree to go their separate ways. Again, this is an example from the book, the catering example. James agrees to cater Bill's son's graduation, but it looks like Bill's son is not going to graduate. Both parties agree to rescind the contract. James does not need to cater, and Bill does not need to pay. Sort of like that other nice ending that we talked about when both parties both fulfilled their obligations under the agreement. Here, both parties decide to go their separate ways. There's no need for the contract anymore. There's a mutual rescission. Everyone's nice, and there's a happy ending to the story. Let's also talk about discharge by mutual agreement, where you have a substituted contract. So here's the parties agree to substitute a new agreement for the current agreement. And this happens all the time. You just need to make sure that the new agreement is clear that it is extinguishing the old agreement. Here's a sample clause. This agreement supersedes all prior agreements and understandings, whether written or oral, between the parties with respect to the subject matter hereof. Discharge by operation of law. Let's talk about the first one, statute of limitations. You recall that the statute of limitations is a certain time period within which you must bring a lawsuit. So in this situation, if the time period expires, the statute of limitations, that is, expires for you to sue on your contract, then the contract is effectively discharged. Now, the issue with this is you still have an ethical obligation to fulfill that contract, but you just can't be forced to fulfill the contract, again, because the statute of limitations has expired. Let's also talk about impossibility of performance. And here we're going to take these in reverse order, subjective impossibility and objective impossibility. So the book gives an example of supplying the 100 bushels of tomatoes by a certain date. And so you have that contract to supply those tomatoes, but you have a flood, wipes out your tomato crop. You really can't supply those tomatoes, but it's really subjectively impossible because you can always go out and purchase those tomatoes somewhere else and then supply those to your buyer. That's subjective impossibility. The book gives a couple of good examples regarding objective impossibility, where performance is just not possible and the contract is discharged. Remember the farmhouse example. You have a contract to sell a certain farmhouse, it's destroyed, and so that contract is then rendered objectively impossible. The subject matter of the contract is just gone. The death or incapacity of somebody who's performing personal services, contract for the famous artist to paint a portrait, and the artist passes away, well, then that contract is just objectively impossible. And then finally, subsequent illegality. A little variation on the example from the book, and again, the artist example was from the book as well. But here you have a contract for a dietary supplement. That supplement later becomes illegal, it's banned. That's objectively impossible as well. It just cannot sell that supplement any longer. Now let's talk about remedies for breach. We're going to talk about legal remedies or money damages, and then equitable remedies. Here are the type of legal remedies: compensatory damages, consequential damages, punitive damages, nominal damages, and liquidated damages. First, compensatory damages. This is where you attempt to put the non-breaching party, probably the plaintiff, in the position he or she would have been in had the contract been performed. Okay, so the book gives an example here of the research assistant. You have a contract to pay a research assistant $2,000 per month, but you let that research assistant go with 2 months left on their contract. So they're owed $4,000 in compensatory damage. Now, the research assistant gets a job, pays them $500 a month, so now the compensatory damages are $3,000, the $4,000 less the $1,000. Or that final bullet, they get a better paying job paying $2,500 per month. Well, in that case, there's no compensatory damages. Let's talk about consequential damages, and let's talk about it in the context of comparing it to compensatory damages. So you can see the citation to the case there of Kirk versus Van Buren. This was a case about a construction contract for the construction of a house. And the contract specified that the house was to be completed within 120 days. And that 120-day time period was a material term of the contract. The court ruled that the additional interest incurred by the person for whom the house was being built, so that additional interest on the construction loan, was a consequential damage. Let's take a look at what the case actually said, that second bullet. The correct measure of damages is the amount necessary to place the non-breaching party in the same position he or she would have been in had the breaching party fully performed. The idea being to make the non-breaching party whole. So that's the definition of compensatory damages. Now, consequential damages may also be awarded, and are those damages which may reasonably be supposed to have been contemplated by the parties as the probable result of such breach. So here the court is saying that it was reasonable to suppose that the non-breaching party would have incurred interest on the construction loan. That was a consequential damage. Let's talk about other monetary damages. We have punitive damages. This comes up in the context of usually torts, but punitive damages are damages meant to punish, and they're rarely awarded in a contract situation. Nominal damages is when you really have no real damage, so a nominal amount is awarded. And finally, liquidated damages. This is determined ahead of time and put in the contract. It might be difficult to determine when you're entering into contract the amount of damages that could be incurred upon a breach. So you fix at a certain amount in the contract. You put it in there, or you put a formula in there. But you have to be careful, because those amounts or those formulas could be determined to result in a penalty if they're unreasonable. Mitigation of damages. This is where the non-breaching party must attempt to minimize or mitigate his or her damages. The book gives an example, the hotel room example. So you've rented 10 rooms to a person who later notifies you that they're canceling the reservation. We have a duty to try to rent those rooms out. You just can't sit on them and collect your damages. Again, you have a duty to mitigate damages. So we've talked about money damages. Let's talk about equitable remedies. These are unique resolutions where money will not satisfy the non-breaching party. The book talks about rescission and restitution. This is where you just want to call it quits, so that's rescission, and any property given is returned, that's restitution. Then you have specific performance. Here the breaching party must still fulfill the terms of the agreement. They must still specifically perform the agreement. Money damages aren't going to work. And in this situation, it's where you're dealing with land, because land is unique, and sometimes with goods. Let's take a look at an example. This is from the Ohio Revised Code Annotated Edition, and this is in the notes called Notes to Decisions. Let's read this quote together. Where a buyer purchases a machine which the evidence shows is unique, and where the machine is shown to be innately defective and substantially inoperable from the time it arrived, and where the financial circumstances of the buyer are such that it would be folly to contend that the buyer could have avoided his business losses by buying a comparable machine from another seller, the buyer is entitled, pursuant to Revised Code Section 1302.90, to specific performance. What does that mean? Requiring the seller to deliver and install a new machine since the buyer has suffered irreparable harm and has no adequate remedy at law. This is a situation where money damages just aren't going to do it. Specific performance is called for. Some other equitable remedies. Let's talk about injunction. This is forcing someone to do something or refrain from doing something. Now, it's very difficult to get what you would call specific performance to force somebody to do something they don't want to do. But you may be able to force someone not to do something. The book talks about the lounge singer example. So you have a lounge singer under contract, and then that person goes to work for another lounge. So there's a possibility of getting an injunction to stop the singer from performing at the other lounge until the term of the contract ends. And then you have the example of preliminary injunction. This is the rare car example. So Jim has an agreement to sell Bob a unique or rare car for $15,000. Jim backs out of the deal. Sarah wants to buy the car for $20,000. Bob wants to get an injunction to prevent Jim from selling the car to Sarah until their dispute is resolved. That concludes our discussion regarding Chapter 14. Thanks for your attention, and we'll see you next time.